Welcome to the OK Let's Learn podcast. This is two podcasts in one. One where we dive into tons of interesting topics, and another where we dive into tons of interesting books and stories. My name is Kevin O'Keefe. So today, let's learn all about the life of Susan B. Anthony. When you think about the fight for women getting the right to vote in our country, one name always arises above, and yeah, it's Susan B. Anthony. Her face is on a United States coin. Yeah, it looks like a quarter and didn't really go far, but schools, bridges, organizations are named after her. During her lifetime, she was mocked in newspapers, she was made fun of, she was shouted down in public meetings, she was arrested for voting, she was called dangerous, she was considered radical. But think about it, isn't that the case with anyone that ended up becoming influential, making change, influencing change? Yeah, it's not easy. And certainly this is the case of the life of Susan B. Anthony. She was born on February 15th, 1820 in Adams, Massachusetts, far northwestern corner of Massachusetts. She was the second of 7 children, born to Daniel Anthony and Lucy Reed Anthony. Her father was a Quaker businessman. He owned a cotton mill. Her mother was actually raised as a Baptist, and her mother's father was Daniel Reed, who fought in the American Revolution and actually later served in the Massachusetts state government. So she had a huge connection to our early foundings in our government. But Mom, like I said, originally was a Baptist, but she fell in love with Daniel Anthony. And Susan's parents were married in 1817. So the household that Susan grew up in was Quaker, which was defined as having discipline, but honesty, education being a foundation, and equality mattered more than anything else. Despite the fact that you were a woman, you were considered equal in the eyes of Quaker household, and that was her foundation, no doubt. Early on, it was clear that Susan was smart. There were stories that she learned how to read on her own by 3-4 years old. By the time she was 6, the family moved across the border into New York in Battenville. Her father's business expanded. Workers from the mill ended up boarding in her house. Everyone around her was always working. Without realizing it, she was developing her relentless work ethic that became part of who she was. But there was one moment early on at elementary school that changed her life forever. And it was a simple moment, but it was dramatic. Because Susan was smart, she knew so much more than her classmates. She asked her teacher to help her learn long division. Her teacher was a man, and he said, "No, I am not teaching you advanced mathematics. You're a woman, and you know what? All you need to do is learn how to run a household and read the Bible." Susan came home that day from school. She told her father, and he was livid. He immediately pulled them out of the local public school, and now all the Anthony children were educated at home in their living room. And you know what? Susan learned at that moment that boys and girls, men and women, should be educated equally and have all the same rights. This stayed with her forever. And it wasn't so much about equal rights. What stayed with Susan was this idea that society out there expected less from girls and almost wanted less from girls. Now, to be clear, whether or not this particular quote came from this teacher about women only being able to read the Bible, that's disputed by historians. But there was no question that what happened was that this teacher said, no, you're a woman and you cannot learn advanced mathematics. And this is what drove her father crazy. Now, as Susan got older, she became a teacher, and this was one of the few acceptable, I should say, jobs that women had in the society at that time. We're talking basically early 1800s. When she was 17, the United States was struck by this financial collapse called the Panic of 1837. Banks failed, businesses collapsed, and one of the businesses that collapsed was her father's cotton mill. They went bankrupt as a family. They had to sell everything that they owned just to pay the debts, and Susan had to leave the family. She ended up traveling down to New Rochelle, New York. I once lived there, and got a teaching job at a Quaker school. And this is when, again, her early formative years, that she saw the injustices that were out there between men and women. Male teachers with less experience earned 3 times, 4 times as much money as women. Susan earned a fraction of her counterparts at the school who were male. That planted another lifelong belief in her mind that women deserved equal pay for equal work. In 1845, the Anthony family moved again, this time to a farm near Rochester, New York. This move was also huge in Susan's life. Why? Here you have this new community, this new city that was built up along the Erie Canal, and it was a hotbed for abolitionists, activists, and reformers that were looking for change. Susan's family home became a meeting place for some of the most amazing and influential people in the history of our country. Imagine this, a young woman sitting in a living room listening to people debate about slavery, justice, women's rights, equality, freedom, everything. And guess who she met? Frederick Douglass, William Lloyd Garrison, and all of these connections. She realized that it wasn't just women's right, women's equality, not being paid as much as men. She saw everything that was wrong with society. They were all connected. And this is what drove her career. At first, believe it or not, one of the big movements in the society at this time was something called the temperance movement. A lot of people don't remember this, but it was a huge movement in the 1800s that focused on limiting or getting rid of banning alcohol. Why did a lot of women support temperance, again, banning alcohol? Because it destroyed families. Husbands, men who drank too much often, spent money that was belonging to the family. Men did not hold their liquor well, and they'd abandoned responsibilities, and families were ruined. And women had very few legal protections at this time. A lot of states, if you were married, you didn't control your own money or property. Susan realized something that was huge in terms of what she challenged going forward. Women could not truly protect themselves or change laws unless they could vote, unless they could influence politics. Politics, for my younger members of the audience, is all about working in the government to change society through laws. And women, as it was in society at that time, were said that no, women didn't and couldn't be involved in politics. So one day in 1852, more humiliation for Susan. She attended a temperance convention and tried to speak. The organizers refused to let her talk, not because she wasn't smart, not because she didn't have experience. It was because she was a woman. She was furious. That same year, she met a person who would later become her biggest partner in history, her biggest partner in the women's suffrage movement. Suffrage is all about voting. Her name was Elizabeth Cady Stanton. Their partnership was so influential and so important for women's rights. She, Cady Stanton, was married. She was outspoken. She was a brilliant writer. She had children and managed a huge household. But Susan, she didn't marry. She never married. She was very disciplined. She was organized. And Susan took on the job of carrying the message forward, traveling all across the country to deliver the message that Cady wrote down. They were a great partnership. Cady was a little bit older. Anthony was young. They spent decades working side by side. Now, again, it's important to stop here because you have to understand what Susan B. Anthony was up against. Mid-1800s, women could not vote in national elections. Women could not legally own property on their own. They often lost the rights to take care of their children. Often, women could not go to college. Often, many jobs were not available to women. And finally, often, no, women couldn't speak in public. They were mocked, they were criticized if they got out of the house and wanted to advocate for themselves. Laws could not be changed because women did not have representation. They did not vote. So you may be thinking, well, how could this be possibly fair? Well, the ideas were that, yes, men would advocate for their wives and would vote for their families. But guess what? This wasn't always the case. And again, it's hard for us to understand this today, but during that time, it was thought if you gave women the right to vote, to have political power, that this would destroy the traditional family structures. This is why she was considered radical, because they believed that she was challenging the entire system of how our society was set up. But then, everything stopped. Why? Because the American Civil War started. Anthony and Stanton actually at this time started focusing exclusively on ending slavery, helping the Union. The idea, going back to the Declaration of Independence, was all men are created equal. Obviously, that was not the case. So they fought side by side with abolitionists to help African Americans be able to get the right to vote because they thought, yes, women would be able to get the right to vote coming out of the Civil War. But no, the 15th Amendment only granted these rights to black men, not women. This created huge divisions within the women's reform movements. Anthony and Stanton were devastated that once again women were excluded. Some people broke away from them. Critics accused them of being too demanding. The women's rights movement lost momentum for many, many years after that, but Susan B. Anthony refused to stop. The moment that made her famous was in 1872. She walked into a polling place in Rochester, New York, and voted for the president. She knew it was illegal, but she believed the Constitution protected her rights as a citizen. A few days later, she was arrested. The country exploded with debate. Newspapers covered the story everywhere. At her 1873 trial, the judge practically guaranteed her conviction before the jury even finished deliberating. She was only fined $100. She refused to pay. And believe it or not, the government never forced her to. Her courtroom speech became legendary. She argued that governments could not claim to be democracies, could not claim to represent all citizens, while you denied half the population the ability to vote. The arrest turned her into a national symbol. For decades afterwards, Susan traveled almost nonstop. Crowds loved her, they welcomed her, but others insulted her. Slowly, though, change began to happen. Western states led the way. Wyoming granted women's voting rights in 1869. Colorado followed a few years later in 1893. Then came Utah. Then came Idaho. The reality out west was that women routinely worked alongside men to establish farms, ranches, towns, and that fostered an environment that was more appreciative of the women's contributions. The women were outnumbered 8-1, and part of the calculus with getting women to vote was to get more women out west. I mean, it's a huge topic and something we will definitely cover in future episodes with future women in this important suffrage movement. But here we are. Anthony is getting older and nothing is happening on a national level. The movement was fractured between different philosophies as to how to get women to be able to vote throughout the entire country, and very often it was supported to go state by state, but it wasn't happening out east. It was too controversial. It was a position that men should be the only ones to vote that was so ingrained in the culture and the history of this area of the country that nothing was moving forward. As I mentioned, Susan B. Anthony never married and never had children. This partly reflected her personal choice, but it also partly reflected the legal realities of marriage during her lifetime. Women often lost their independence under the law once they got married, and she believed that her mission was to move the women's suffrage movement to the next level instead of having a family of her own. In 1906, at the age of 86, she gave one final speech. Near the end, she declared, "Failure is impossible." A few weeks later, she passed away. And here's the bittersweet truth. She did not live long enough to see women gain the right to vote nationwide. When she passed away, only a handful of Western states, as I mentioned, allowed full women's suffrage. Most American women still could not cast a ballot, but the movement she helped build was now unstoppable. It was an unstoppable train that was headed right into the station, and a new generation took over. One of those leaders was Carrie Chapman Catt. Another leader was Alice Paul, and they moved forward, and they were the lightning bolt that helped finally in 1920, 14 years after Anthony's death, the 19th Amendment to the United States Constitution became law. Women across the country now officially were granted the constitutional right to vote. People called it the Susan B. Anthony Amendment. This lady who was arrested for voting eventually became one of the most important faces of American democracy itself. And perhaps this is the greatest lesson from her life, that you know what? Real change doesn't happen overnight. In some cases, it takes years, generations. And sometimes the people that start these great movements rarely see the finish line themselves. But because Susan B. Anthony refused to quit, today millions of women have gained a voice in our country and our future. Friends, thanks for staying with me on this journey, learning all about the life of Susan B. Anthony, the beginning of the women's suffrage movement. No doubt we'll have future episodes on the entire movement, all the peaks and valleys, all the other important women and men that made this happen. But reach out to me at kevmok21@gmail.com. We have a Facebook group, OK Let's Learn. We have a YouTube channel, OK Let's Learn. Hit the plus sign in the top right-hand corner of your Apple podcast. This will subscribe you to the podcast. You'll get the new episodes each time they're released, so you get them right there on your phone. We're getting out episodes every couple days. If you have people in your life that are curious, love to learn, love podcasts, then send them this podcast. Much appreciated. Also appreciate the ratings and reviews. That'll help the algorithm out there. That'll help more people come to see the podcast. And listen, until next time, have fun and keep learning.